What if the biggest mistake in your English leads you to the love of your life and a life you never imagined in America? If you've ever felt stuck, embarrassed, or ready to give up on learning English, this story might feel uncomfortably familiar. I was once that person, lost in translation, afraid to speak. But one awkward sentence changed everything. Stay with me, because this journey from strangers to soulmates might just change how you learn forever. Lost in America. What if the moment you feel most embarrassed speaking English is actually the moment your life quietly begins to change? You don't have to imagine too hard. Just think about the last time you wanted to say something in English, but your brain froze like a computer with no battery. Your heart beat a little faster, your mouth opened and then closed again. And you told yourself, maybe next time. I lived inside that next time for a long time. On my first day in the United States, everything felt like a movie I couldn't understand. People laughed fast, talked fast, moved fast, lived fast. And me? I was running at 5x speed. Even simple questions like, how are you? Felt like a small test. I'm fine, thank you, and you? You've probably said that before. It's the safest answer. The one almost every English learner uses. But here's the strange part. They keep talking and suddenly, you understand nothing. That's when it hits you. Learning English in school and living in English are two completely different worlds. In America, no one waits for you to speak slowly. No one corrects every mistake. And no one knows how many years you studied English. All they see is one thing. Can you communicate or not? And I couldn't. One morning, I walked into a small coffee shop. It smelled amazing, warm, rich, comforting. I stood in line, repeating my sentence over and over in my head. One coffee, please. Simple, right? But when it was my turn, the cashier asked something I didn't prepare for. For here or to go? My brain hit pause. I knew each word separately, but together, they made no sense. I stood there in silence for about 3 seconds. But you already know 3 seconds in a fast-paced place like America feels like 30. My heart started racing. My hands felt slightly shaky. I could feel the people behind me waiting. This wasn't just a language problem. This was psychological. There's something called language anxiety. When your brain feels judged, it activates a fight or flight response. That means you either say something random or you want to disappear. And I chose a third option. I smiled in a very meaningless way. Sorry? I said. The cashier repeated the question. Faster this time. I still didn't understand. So in the end, I just pointed randomly and said, yes. Yes to a question I didn't understand. Can you guess what happened? I got my coffee, but not the way I wanted. And more importantly, I walked away with a heavy feeling. I didn't belong here. Maybe you've felt that before. That strange frustration when you know you're not stupid. You know you studied. But when it's time to use English, everything disappears. That's not because you're bad at learning. It's because the way you learned doesn't match how your brain works in real life. Your brain doesn't learn best through isolated vocabulary lists. It learns through context, emotion, and natural repetition. That's why you can remember lyrics from an English song, but forget a list of 50 words in 2 days. At that time, I didn't understand any of this. All I knew was that every day in America felt like a small challenge. Going to the supermarket was a challenge. Asking for directions was a challenge. Even listening to conversations made me tired. You're trying to translate every word in your head, but they're not speaking word by word. They speak in chunks, in rhythm, in emotion. It's like trying to enjoy a song, but stopping at every single note. No one listens to music like that. One evening, I sat alone in a small room. Outside, it was colder than I expected. And America didn't just feel cold because of the weather. It felt cold because I had no one to talk to. I opened my phone and looked at my saved vocabulary list. Hundreds of words. But I couldn't use them to form a smooth sentence. That's when a very honest thought appeared. Maybe I'm just not good at English. Sound familiar? This is the moment when many people quit. Not because they lack ability, but because they don't see progress fast enough to continue. But here's something interesting about your brain that no one tells you. Real progress often happens right after you feel like quitting. It's like going to the gym. The moment you want to stop is exactly when your muscles begin to change. The question is, will you stay long enough to see it? That night, I didn't have an answer. I just felt tired. Tired of trying to understand. Tired of trying to speak. Tired of always being the slowest person in every conversation. But what I didn't know was this. Just a few days later, a very simple, very silly English mistake would change everything. Not in a perfect way. Not like suddenly fluent overnight. But in a very human way, awkward, imperfect, and real. And if you're in that stage right now where everything feels hard, then the next part might be exactly what you need. Because sometimes, the thing that opens the biggest door in your life is one wrong sentence. The mistake that changed everything. Have you ever said something in English and immediately wished you could delete it from existence? Not correct it. Not explain it. Just erase it completely, like it never happened. Because that's exactly what I wanted to do that day. It was a quiet afternoon in early autumn. The air in America felt different, cool, a little sharp, but strangely calming. I had decided to go to a public park, not because I felt confident, but because I was tired of hiding inside my room. Sometimes, progress doesn't start with motivation. It starts with boredom. I sat on a wooden bench, watching people walk their dogs, jog, laugh, talk effortlessly in a language that still felt like a puzzle to me. I told myself I would try something small that day. Just one sentence. Just one real interaction. No pressure. No perfection. That's what I told myself. A few minutes later, someone sat down at the other end of the bench. I noticed them only because they dropped something, a book. It slid off their lap and landed near my feet. This was it. A simple moment. A simple chance. My brain immediately started preparing a sentence. Your book fell. Clear. Correct. Safe. But when I opened my mouth, something else came out. You drop your life. Silence. Not the comfortable kind. The kind that stretches just a little too long. They looked at me confused. I froze. Because in my head, I knew what I meant to say. But what I actually said sounded dramatic. Almost philosophical. Maybe even a little crazy. You drop your book. I quickly corrected, my face already warm with embarrassment. They blinked once. Then something unexpected happened. They laughed. Not in a mocking way. Not the kind that makes you feel small. It was light, surprised, almost curious. My life, huh? They said, smiling. That sounds more serious than just a book. And just like that, something shifted. You see, most learners are afraid of making mistakes because they think mistakes close doors. But in reality, the right mistake in the right moment can open one. There's a concept in language learning called emotional memory. It had all three. I laughed too, a little awkwardly. Sorry, my English not good, I said slowly. They shook their head. No, it's good. It's interesting. Interesting. That word stayed with me. Because for the first time, my mistake wasn't treated like a failure. It was treated like something human. Something real. We started talking. Slowly. Very slowly. What's your name? They asked. I understood that one. I answered. Then came another question. Slightly harder. I didn't catch every word, but I caught enough. And when I didn't understand, I did something I used to avoid. I asked them to repeat. Sorry, can you say again? And they did. No judgment. No impatience. This is something many people don't realize about real conversations in America. Most people don't expect perfection. They expect effort. They respond to energy, not grammar. We spoke in short sentences. Sometimes broken. Sometimes incorrect. But something surprising was happening. I was communicating. Not perfectly. Not smoothly. But genuinely. At one point, I wanted to say, I'm trying to improve my English. But what came out was, I try to make my English better every day, but my brain's slow. They smiled again. Your brain is not slow, they said. It's just learning. Simple sentence. But it hit differently. Because when you're struggling, it's easy to label yourself. Slow. Bad. Not good enough. But learning a language isn't about being fast. It's about being consistent. We talked for maybe 15 minutes. It felt like 5 and also like an hour. Time to something strange when you're fully present. Before leaving, they said something that I didn't fully understand at first. Same time tomorrow. I paused. My brain processed each word like pieces of a puzzle. Same time tomorrow. They were asking to meet again. Yes, I said a little too quickly. Yes, I come. And then I walked away, replaying the entire conversation in my head. Every mistake. Every sentence. Every small success. That night, something was different. I didn't open my vocabulary list. I didn't try to memorize anything. Instead, I replayed the story. Because your brain loves stories more than lists. Stories give context, emotion, meaning. And without realizing it, I had just experienced one of the most powerful ways to learn a language, real human connection. There's research showing that when you use language in meaningful interaction, your brain forms stronger neural pathways. You're not just remembering words, you're building experiences. That's why one awkward conversation in a park can teach you more than hours of silent study. But here's the part one didn't expect. I wasn't just learning English. I was starting to look forward to it. To the next conversation. To the next mistake. To the next moment of not knowing and figuring it out. Because something about that person, the way they listened, the way they didn't rush me, the way they smiled at my mistakes, made English feel less like a test and more like a bridge. I didn't know who they really were yet. I didn't know what role they would play in my life. But I knew one thing for sure. That sentence, you drop your life, was no longer something I wanted to erase. It was the beginning of something I didn't see coming. And sometimes, the most important step forward starts with saying the wrong thing. Awkward conversations, real connection. What if the secret to sounding natural in English is not speaking perfectly, but speaking imperfectly, again and again, until it becomes real? That sounds almost too simple, right? But the next day, sitting on that same wooden bench, I started to understand why. I arrived early. Not because I was confident, but because I was nervous in a new way. The kind of nervous that feels a little like excitement. My brain kept replaying yesterday's conversation like a song stuck on repeat. You drop your life. I still cringed a little, but I also smiled. Because somehow that mistake had turned into a connection. A few minutes later, they appeared, walking calmly, holding the same book. This time they didn't drop it.
Hey, they said.
Just one word.
Simple. Light. Iraplia.
And then silence. Not the awkward, painful silence from before, but a quiet space where both of us were waiting, giving each other time. This is something you don't learn in textbooks. Silence is part of real conversation. In language learning, we often panic when there's a pause. We think we must fill every second with words. But in reality, native speakers pause all the time. They think. They breathe. They choose words. That day, I allowed myself to pause. So, you come here often? I said, slowly, carefully building each word. Yes, it sounded like a cliché. Even I knew that. But it worked. They smiled.
Yeah,
It's quiet here.
good place to think.
I caught most of it. Not every word, but enough. And that's another shift. You don't need to understand 100% to connect. Even 60 to 70% is enough to keep a conversation alive. We started talking again. Short sentences. Small ideas. I work nearby, I said. Oh yeah? What do you do? This question used to scare me. Because explaining your job means forming longer sentences, using specific vocabulary, staying clear. My brain hesitated. But instead of stopping, I broke it into pieces. I help in a small office. Paper, computer, emails. Not perfect, but understandable. And something interesting happened. They didn't correct my grammar. They simply responded. Got it. That sounds busy. This is how natural conversation works. People focus on meaning, not mistakes. There's actually a psychological principle behind this called comprehensible input and output. When you speak just slightly beyond your comfort zone, your brain stretches, but not enough to panic. That's exactly where learning happens. We continued like that, building a conversation one simple sentence at a time. At one point they asked, "Why did you come to the US?" This question felt bigger, heavier, because the answer wasn't just about language. It was about life. I took a breath. I want new life, new chance. But English, hard for me. There it was. Honest, unpolished. They nodded slowly.
Yeah, it's not easy.
But you're doing it. That sentence stayed with me longer than I expected. Because when you're learning something difficult, you rarely feel like you're doing it. You feel like you're failing slowly. But from the outside, effort looks like progress.
We talked about small things. Food.
Weather. Daily routines. I said, I don't understand. American jokes.
They laughed.
Honestly, sometimes I don't either. That surprised me. Because I always assumed native speakers understood everything. Every joke. Every phrase. Every situation. But that's not true. Language, even for native speakers, is sometimes confusing, strange, unpredictable. That realization did something important to my mindset. It made English feel less like a perfect system and more like a shared experience. At one point, I tried to tell a story about my first day at the coffee shop. I say yes, but I don't know question, I explained. They laughed again, this time louder. Oh no, what did you get? I don't know, but not what I want, I said, smiling. We both laughed. And in that moment, something clicked. I wasn't just practicing English. I was living in it. There's a big difference. When you practice, you focus on being correct. When you live in the language, you focus on being understood. And ironically, that's when you start improving faster. Studies in language acquisition show that emotional engagement, like laughter, curiosity, even small embarrassment, helps the brain retain information longer. That means every time you laugh during a conversation, your brain is quietly learning. After about 20 minutes, I noticed something surprising. I wasn't translating every word anymore. I was listening and responding, not perfectly, not fluently, but more naturally. It's like your brain slowly stops building sentences word by word and starts recognizing patterns, chunks, phrases, rhythm. That's how native speakers talk. Not one word at a time, but in connected pieces. Before leaving, they looked at me and said, "You're improving, you know." I blinked. Really? Yeah. You're more relaxed today. Relaxed. That word mattered more than correct. Because tension blocks learning. When you're afraid, your brain focuses on survival, not growth. But when you feel safe, even a little, everything opens up. I think because you are patient, I said. They shrugged lightly. Or maybe because you didn't give up after saying you'd drop your life. We both laughed again. But behind that joke was something real. Most people quit right after their first embarrassing mistake. They avoid speaking again. They go back to silent learning. They hide. But what if that's exactly the wrong move? What if the moment you feel most embarrassed is actually your best opportunity to grow? That day, walking home, I felt something new. Not confidence. Not yet. But possibility. And sometimes that's even more powerful. Because confidence comes later. It grows slowly. But possibility? It appears in a moment. A small conversation. A shared laugh. An awkward sentence that somehow turns into something meaningful. I didn't know it yet, but this wasn't just the beginning of better English. It was the beginning of something much deeper. Something I couldn't translate. Something I could only feel. And it all started with a conversation that didn't go perfectly. Maybe that's the point. Maybe it was never supposed to. Culture shock hits hard. Have you ever felt like you understood the words, but still didn't understand the world around them? That's a different kind of confusion. A deeper one. And it doesn't show up in your vocabulary list. It shows up in real life. A few days after those quiet park conversations started to feel almost normal, something shifted again.
Not in a dramatic way.
No big argument. No sudden conflict. Just a series of small moments that made me realize language is only half the story. The other half is culture. And culture can hit you harder than grammar ever will. It started with something simple. Let's hang out sometime, they said casually as we stood up to leave the park. I smiled. Yes, okay. Tomorrow? They laughed softly. Oh, I didn't mean tomorrow. Just, sometime.
Sometime.
That word confused me more than any fast sentence ever had. Because where I came from, when you say you will meet, you usually mean a specific time. A real plan. Something clear. But here, words were softer. Less direct. More flexible.
Inådde you understood.
But inside, I didn't. This is something many English learners don't expect. You can understand every word in a sentence and still misunderstand the meaning. Because meaning lives in culture, not just language. A few days later, I decided to invite them for coffee. I want to invite you to drink coffee this Sunday, I said carefully. They paused. Sunday might be busy. I'll let you know. I'll let you know. Another sentence that sounds simple, but feels unclear. Does it mean yes? No? Maybe? In my mind, I waited for a clear answer, but none came. Sunday passed. No message.
No explanation.
And I felt something uncomfortable growing inside me. Was I too direct? Too strange? Did I say something wrong again? This is where cultural differences quietly become emotional misunderstandings. In American culture, communication is often indirect in social situations. People avoid saying no directly to be polite. They leave space. They keep things open. But if you're not used to that, it feels like rejection without explanation. And when you're already insecure about your English, your brain fills the gap with negative thoughts. Maybe my English is too bad. Maybe I sounded weird. Maybe they don't want to talk to me anymore. Your brain doesn't like uncertainty, so it creates stories. And those stories are usually not kind. There's actually a psychological concept called negativity bias. Your brain is more likely to focus on negative interpretations, especially when you lack full information. So instead of thinking, they're just busy, you think, I did something wrong. I stopped going to the park for 2 days. Not because I didn't want to learn English, but because I didn't want to feel that confusion again. That quiet disappointment. That invisible distance. This is the part no one talks about when learning a language abroad. It's not just about words. It's about identity. When you can't express yourself fully, you don't feel like your real self. You feel smaller, less interesting, less you. And that feeling can slowly push you to isolate yourself. But here's the twist. Avoiding real interaction doesn't protect you. It freezes you. Your brain needs real-world input to grow. It needs imperfect conversations, confusing moments, even emotional discomfort. Because that's where adaptation begins. On the third day, I went back. Not because I felt brave, but because staying away felt worse. They were already there, sitting on the bench, reading the same book. They looked up.
Hey.
Haven't seen you in a couple days. Their tone was normal.
Warm.
No distance. And suddenly, all the negative stories in my head felt a little silly. I think I misunderstand something, I said slowly, sitting down. They closed the book. About what? You say, sometime. I think maybe you don't want meat. They blinked, then smiled gently. Oh no, I did want to hang out. I just had a busy weekend.
Busy.
Simple explanation. No drama. No hidden meaning. Just a difference in communication style. And just like that, the confusion started to dissolve. This is one of the biggest lessons in both language and relationships. Clarity doesn't always come from better grammar. It comes from asking, from checking, from being willing to look a little awkward to avoid bigger misunderstandings. I'm still learning not just English, but how people talk here. I admitted. They nodded.
Yeah.
It takes time. Even small things can mean different stuff. Different stuff. That phrase stayed with me because suddenly I saw everything differently. When someone says we should catch up, it might not mean a real plan. When someone says I'll think about it, it might mean no. When someone smiles, it doesn't always mean agreement. It can mean politeness. Language is layered. And if you only listen to the words, you miss the meaning. But here's the good news. Once you become aware of this, your learning becomes deeper. You stop chasing perfect sentences. You start understanding people. And that's when communication becomes real. That afternoon, our conversation felt different. Not easier, but clearer. More honest. Because now, I wasn't just trying to speak English. I was trying to understand a new way of living. A new rhythm. A new logic. And slowly it started to make sense. Not perfectly, but enough. Before we left, they said something that felt simple but meant a lot more this time. Let's actually plan something. Coffee this Thursday? I smiled. A real plan. A real time. Yes, I said. This time, I understand. They laughed. And so did I. Because sometimes, the hardest part of learning English isn't the language. It's learning how not to misunderstand the silence between the words. An unexpected study partner. What if the fastest way to improve your English isn't studying harder, but finding the right person to struggle with? That sounds almost unfair, right? Because most people think progress comes from discipline, textbooks, and long hours alone. And yes, those things help. But what I discovered next changed everything I thought I knew about learning. It started with that simple plan. Coffee this Thursday. This time, there was no confusion.
No, sir. No guessing.
Just a clear day, a clear place, and a clear intention. And somehow that made me more nervous than before, because now it felt real. I arrived early again. Same habit. Same quiet anxiety. But this time, I didn't rehearse full sentences in my head. I tried something different. I prepared ideas, not words. This is a small shift, but it changes everything. When you prepare words, your brain gets stuck trying to remember the correct version. But when you prepare ideas, your brain becomes flexible. It finds simple ways to express meaning. And meaning is what keeps conversations alive. When they walked into the coffee shop, they smiled like it was the most normal thing in the world. Hey, you made it. I say I come, so I come, I replied, a little proud of myself. We ordered drinks. This time, when the cashier asked, for here or to go, I understood immediately.
For here, I said.
Small win. But here's the interesting part. That small win felt bigger than memorizing 100 vocabulary words. Because it was real. It was used. It was alive. We sat down near the window. Light came in softly. People talked around us. But for once, the noise didn't feel overwhelming. It felt like background music. So, they said, what do you want to get better at in English? That question surprised me. Because no one had asked me that before. Teachers told me what to learn. Apps told me what to practice. But no one asked what I wanted. I paused. I want to understand people. And speak without fear, I said. They nodded. That's a good goal. Not perfect grammar. Just real communication. Real communication. That phrase became the center of everything after that. From that day on, something changed between us. We didn't just meet. We practiced. But not in the way you imagine.
No textbooks. No formal lessons. No boring repetition.
We used real life. We talked about what we saw, what we felt, what we experienced that day. One day, I said, today my boss speak very fast. I catch maybe 30%. They laughed. That's normal. Even I miss stuff when people talk too fast. That made me feel less alone. Then they added something important. Don't try to understand every word. Listen for the main idea. This is actually a proven listening strategy. Your brain can't process fast speech word by word. It needs to recognize patterns, keywords, tone, and context. That's how native speakers listen. So instead of chasing every word, you follow the meaning. We started practicing this together. They would tell me short stories. Simple ones. Not slow, but not too fast. And after each story, they would ask, what do you understand? Not what did I say exactly? But what do you understand? That difference matters. Because it trains your brain to focus on meaning, not perfection. Sometimes I understood 50%. Sometimes 70%. Sometimes only 20%. But each time I improved a little. And when I didn't understand, I learned to say, can you say that again slower?
Or,
can you explain in another way? These are powerful sentences. Because they keep the conversation going. Many learners stay silent when they don't understand. But silence stops learning. Questions continue it. There's also something else happening quietly in the background. I was getting used to their voice, their rhythm, their accent, their way of speaking. This is called ear training. The more you listen to one person consistently, the easier it becomes to understand them. Your brain builds a map of their sound patterns. And once that happens, your confidence grows. Not because English becomes easy, but because it becomes familiar. One afternoon, I realized something surprising. I was no longer afraid of making mistakes with them. I still made them, of course. I very like this place, I said once. They smiled. I really like this place too. They didn't say, that's wrong. They showed the correct version naturally. This is called implicit correction. And it works better than direct correction for many learners. Because it doesn't interrupt your flow. It doesn't make you feel judged. It just guides you. Over time, I started copying their phrases. I really like, that makes sense. I didn't think about it that way. These are called chunks. And chunks are the secret to sounding natural. Native speakers don't build sentences from grammar rules in real time. They use stored phrases. So instead of learning single words, I started learning pieces of language. living pieces. And then something even more unexpected happened. I started to look forward to these meetings not just for English, but for them. The conversations became easier, longer, more personal. We talked about childhood, family, dreams, fears. And somehow, even with my limited English, I felt understood. That's when I realized something important. Connection doesn't require perfect language. It requires honesty, effort, presence. Before leaving one day, they said, "You know, you're improving fast." I smiled. "Because I have good teacher?" They shook their head.
No.
"Because you show up."
And you try.
That stayed with me. Because maybe progress isn't about talent. Maybe it's about showing up again and again, even when it feels uncomfortable. And maybe the right person at the right time can turn something difficult into something meaningful. I didn't know where this connection was going. I didn't know what role they would play in my life. But I knew one thing. I was no longer learning English alone. And that changed everything. Because sometimes the difference between giving up and moving forward is just one person who sits down next to you and says, "Let's try again." Slow listening changed everything. What if the reason you can't understand fast English is because you've never truly learned how to listen slowly? It sounds strange, right? In a world where everything is fast, fast speech, fast content, fast results, the idea of slow listening feels almost wrong. But this is where everything started to shift for me. Not with more vocabulary, not with harder grammar, but with something much simpler. Slowing down. It happened one afternoon when we were sitting in the same coffee shop, sunlight hitting the table just right, the quiet hum of conversations around us. "I think people speak too fast," I said, slightly frustrated. They smiled. "Or maybe you're trying to listen too fast." That sentence stayed in my head longer than I expected. Because I realized something uncomfortable. Every time someone spoke English to me, I panicked. My brain went into overdrive. Catch every word. Translate everything. Don't miss anything. And that pressure made everything worse. There's actually a cognitive reason for this. Your brain has something called working memory. It can only hold a small amount of information at one time. When you try to process every single word in real time, your working memory gets overloaded. And when that happens, you understand nothing. It's like trying to carry 10 heavy bags at once. You don't move faster. You stop moving completely. So that day, they introduced me to something different. "Let's try an experiment," they said. They told me a short story. Not too slow. Not too fast. Just natural. I didn't understand everything. Maybe 60%. Then they asked, "What did you catch?" I started explaining. Slowly. Broken sentences. "You go store, buy something, but forget wallet?" They nodded. Exactly. Exactly? I was surprised. Because I didn't get every word. But I got the meaning. And that's when it clicked. Listening is not about catching words. It's about catching ideas. From that day, we practiced slow listening in a very specific way. First, they would speak normally. Then, if I didn't understand, they would repeat, but slightly slower, slightly clearer. Not exaggerated. Not unnatural. Just enough for my brain to adjust. And here's what changed everything. I stopped translating in my head. Instead of hearing, I went to the store to grab some milk and thinking word by word in my native language. I started seeing a picture, a person, a store, milk. Your brain is actually much faster with images than with translation. This is backed by neuroscience. Visual processing is quicker and more efficient than language translation. So when you connect English directly to meaning, not your native language, you reduce the delay. And suddenly, everything feels faster. But here's the catch. To get there, you have to slow down first. It's like learning to play music. You don't start at full speed. You start slow. You build accuracy. Then speed comes naturally. Most learners do the opposite. They try to understand fast English immediately and get frustrated when they can't. That's like trying to play a song at full speed on your first try.
Of course it sounds messy.
One day, we tried something new. They played a short audio clip on their phone. A simple conversation. Listen once, they said. I listened. I caught maybe half. Now, tell me the main idea. Not the exact words. Not the grammar.
Just the idea.
They talk about travel, maybe plan trip? I guessed. Good, they said. Now listen again. Second time. More words appeared. More connections. By the third time, it felt clearer. Not perfect, but clearer. This is called repeated exposure. Your brain needs multiple passes to fully understand new sounds. Each time you listen, your brain fills in more gaps. But most people only listen once and give up. They think, I don't understand, so I'm not good at listening. But that's not how learning works. Understanding grows in layers. Not all at once. We did this almost every day. Short audio, real conversations, simple topics, and slowly, something incredible started happening. English didn't feel like noise anymore. It started to feel like language, like something structured, predictable,
familiar.
I began recognizing patterns. Oh, they always say gonna instead of going to. Oh, they connect words like wanna. These are things textbooks rarely prepare you for. Real English is connected, reduced,
Fast.
but once you train your ear slowly, you start hearing those connections naturally. One afternoon, something unexpected happened. I was walking past a group of people talking. Normally, I would just hear noise. But this time, I understood. Not everything, but enough. They were talking about work, about being tired, about weekend plans. Simple things. But to me, it felt like a breakthrough. Because for the first time, I wasn't part of the conversation, but I could still follow it. That's a huge step. It means your listening is becoming automatic. You're no longer fighting for every word. Your brain is starting to flow with the language. That evening, I told them about it. I understand people talk a little, I said, smiling. They smiled back. That's how it starts. Not with perfection, but with moments. Small, quiet moments where things suddenly make sense. And those moments build confidence. Real confidence. Not the kind you force. The kind you earn. There's something else that changed too. I stopped being afraid of fast English. Not because I could understand everything, but because I trusted the process. I knew I could catch the main idea. I knew I could ask for clarification. I knew I could keep going. And that changed everything. Because fear doesn't come from difficulty. It comes from uncertainty. Once you understand how something works, it becomes less scary. Even if it's still hard. Before we left that day, they said something simple. You're not just learning English. You're training your brain to listen differently. And they were right. Because slow listening isn't just a technique. It's a mindset. It's choosing understanding over perfection. Meaning over words. Patience over pressure. And once you learn to listen slowly, you'll be surprised how fast you start to understand. When feelings start to speak. What if the moment you stop worrying about your English is the moment you start noticing your feelings? Because that's exactly what happened to me, and honestly, I didn't see it coming. At first, everything between us was about language, words,
Sounds.
meaning, practice, simple, safe, predictable. But somewhere between the slow conversations, the shared laughter, and those quiet pauses that no longer felt uncomfortable, something changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just quietly. One afternoon, we were sitting in the park again. Same bench, same rhythm. But the conversation felt different. Less structured. More natural. More personal. So, what do you miss most? They asked. That question hit deeper than I expected. Because until that moment, I had been so focused on surviving, on understanding, on speaking, on improving, that I hadn't really stopped to feel. I paused longer than usual. I miss family, I said slowly.
Food. Noise.
People talk, loud but warm. They nodded, listening carefully. Yeah, that makes sense. Then they asked, do you feel lonely here? Lonely. That word felt heavy, because the answer was yes. But saying it out loud in another language made it feel even more real. A little, I admitted. Sometimes very quiet. Too quiet. They didn't interrupt. Didn't rush to respond. They just sat there. And somehow, that silence felt supportive, not empty. This is something powerful about communication that most people don't realize. Understanding isn't just about words. It's about presence. You can say very little and still feel deeply understood. And in that moment, even with my limited English, I felt seen. That's when I started noticing something else. I was no longer just thinking about what to say. I was thinking about how I felt. And that changed the way I spoke. Before, my sentences were mechanical. I go work. I eat lunch. I study English. But now, they became more human. I feel tired today. I feel happy when I understand. I feel better when we talk. Simple words, but real. There's actually a reason for this. Emotion helps memory. When you attach feelings to language, your brain stores it more deeply. It's no longer just information. It becomes experience. That's why you remember conversations that made you laugh or feel nervous or feel connected. And slowly, without realizing it, our conversations became something more than practice. They became something I looked forward to, not just for learning but for feeling. One day, it started raining. Not heavy, just soft, steady rain. We didn't leave. We stayed on the bench under a small shelter. It's kind of nice, they said. Yes, in my country. Rain is loud, I replied. Here quiet. They smiled. You notice small things. I think because everything new, I said. And that was true. When you're in a new place, your brain pays attention to details.
Sounds.
Smells. Emotions. Everything feels sharper. And maybe that's why feelings grow faster too. There was a moment of silence. But this time, it wasn't about thinking of the next sentence. It was just being there. Together. And then they said something unexpected. I like talking with you. Simple sentence. But it stayed with me. Because I understood every word. Clearly. And more importantly, I understood the meaning behind it. I like talking with you too, I said. No hesitation this time. No fear. Just honesty. And that's when I realized something important. Language is not just a tool for communication. It's a bridge for connection. And once that bridge starts to form, everything else follows. There's a concept in psychology called emotional safety. When you feel safe, your brain relaxes. It becomes more open, more flexible, more willing to take risks. And for the first time since arriving in the U.S., I felt that. Not completely, but enough. Enough to try longer sentences. Enough to express more complicated thoughts. Enough to be a little more myself. One afternoon, I said something I had never said before in English. I think before I am afraid speak. Now, I still afraid but I speak anyway. They smiled. That's courage. Courage. Not confidence. Not perfection. Just continuing despite fear. That distinction matters. Because many people wait to feel confident before they speak. But confidence comes after action, not before. And maybe feelings work the same way. You don't wait to feel connected. You connect and then the feeling grows. Over time, I started noticing small things. The way they listened. The way they slowed down when I didn't understand. The way they remembered things I said days before. These are small signals. But they matter. Because connection isn't built on big moments. It's built on consistency, attention,
care.
And slowly, a question started forming in my mind. Not clearly, not logically, just quietly. Is this still just practice? I didn't ask it out loud. Not yet. Because some questions take time. They grow slowly just like everything else in this story. But one thing was clear. I was no longer just learning English. I was feeling something through it. And that made everything more complicated, but also more meaningful. Because sometimes the most important conversations in your life start with simple words and slowly turn into something you never planned. Something you didn't study for. Something you can't translate easily. But somehow you understand. When life gets in the way. What if the hardest part of learning English isn't the language, but everything happening around it? Because just when things started to feel easier, more natural, more connected, life decided to test me in a completely different way. And this time, English wasn't the only challenge. It started quietly. More work hours. More responsibilities. More pressure. At first, I told myself it was temporary. Just this week. I thought. But then 1 week became 2. 2 became 3. And suddenly, my days felt full but not in a good way. I woke up early, rushed to work, tried to keep up with conversations I still didn't fully understand, came home tired, and told myself, I'll practice English tomorrow. Tomorrow. That word again. The same word I used when I was afraid to speak. The same word that slowly creates distance without you noticing. I started missing our usual meetings. First one, then another. Each time I had a reason. I'm busy today.
I'm tired.
I have work. All true. But also, something else was happening. I was slipping back into old habits. Avoidance. When something becomes difficult again, your brain tries to protect you. It tells you to rest, to pause, to wait until you feel ready. But here's the problem. Waiting often turns into quitting. There's a concept in psychology called cognitive load. When your brain is overwhelmed with too many responsibilities, it has less energy for learning. Language learning requires focus, attention, and mental space. And when your day is full of stress, there's no space left. So even though I wanted to keep improving, I didn't. One evening, I got a message. Hey, haven't seen you in a while. Everything okay? I stared at the screen. Simple question. But I didn't know how to answer. Because okay wasn't the right word. But explaining everything in English felt too hard. So I replied with something small. Busy with work.
Sorry.
They responded quickly. No need to be sorry. Just don't disappear. Just don't disappear. That sentence hit harder than I expected, because I realized I already was. Not completely, but slowly. And not just from them. From the version of myself that was trying. The version that showed up, made mistakes, learned, improved. That version was fading. A few days later, we finally met again. Same park. Same bench. But the energy felt different. Not bad. Just distant. You look tired, they said. I am a little, I admitted. We sat in silence for a moment. But this silence wasn't comfortable like before. It was heavier. Because now, there was something unspoken between us. So, how's your English practice going? They asked. I hesitated. Not good. I said honestly. I don't have time. They nodded slowly. I get that. Life gets busy. Then they added something I didn't expect. But if you stop completely, it gets harder to come back. Harder to come back. That's true for almost everything. Exercise, habits, relationships, and language. Because consistency builds momentum. And once momentum is gone, everything feels heavier. I feel like I forget many things, I said. That's normal, they replied. But you're not starting from zero. That idea mattered, because when you stop practicing, it feels like you lost everything. But in reality, your brain still holds the patterns. They're just harder to access, like a path covered in leaves. Still there, just hidden. We decided to do something simple that day. No long conversations, no pressure, just a short walk. And while we walked, they said something that changed the way I saw everything. You don't need more time. You need better moments. Better moments. Not hours of study. Not perfect conditions. Just small, consistent moments. Like what? I asked. Like this, they said. We're walking. We can talk. Simple. Obvious. But powerful. Because I realized I had been waiting for the perfect time to practice. A quiet room. A clear mind. No stress. But life doesn't work like that. If you wait for perfect conditions, you wait forever. So, we started talking again. Not about complex topics. Just simple things. What did you eat today? What happened at work? What made you feel stressed? Short questions. Real answers. And slowly, the rhythm came back. Not as smooth as before. Not as easy. But still there. And that's what matters. Because progress isn't always a straight line. Sometimes it pauses. Sometimes it slows down. Sometimes it feels like it's going backwards. But if you keep showing up, even in small ways, it continues. There's something else I noticed that day. My feelings hadn't disappeared. They were still there. Just quieter. Hidden under stress. Under responsibility. Under daily life. And maybe that's what made everything feel heavier. Because when you disconnect from something meaningful, everything else feels more tiring. Before we left, they said something simple. Same time next week? I smiled. Not a big smile.
But a real one.
Yes, I said. This time, I try not disappear. They laughed softly. Good. I'd miss our strange conversations. Strange conversations. That phrase felt warm, because even though things had changed, something was still there. Not perfect, not easy, but real. And maybe that's the lesson. Life will interrupt you. It will make things harder. It will test your consistency, your motivation, your energy. But it can't stop you unless you stop completely. And sometimes, all it takes to keep going is one small moment, one short conversation, one decision to come back, even when it feels difficult. Because the real danger isn't making mistakes. It's disappearing. And I was just starting to understand that. When English becomes a bridge, what if the thing you once feared the most becomes the very thing that connects you to someone else? Not perfectly.
Not smoothly.
But honestly. Because somewhere between the missed meetings, the slow return, and those small conversations during walks, something changed again. This time, it wasn't about learning. It was about understanding. Real understanding. The kind that doesn't come from grammar rules, but from shared moments. It happened on a quiet evening. We were sitting in a small cafe, not the usual one. This place was warmer, dim lights, soft music in the background. The kind of place where conversations naturally slow down. I think in English more now, I said. They looked at me, slightly surprised. That's a big step. I don't translate everything, only sometimes, I added. They smiled. That means your brain is adapting. adapting. That word felt accurate, because I wasn't forcing English anymore. It was starting to feel natural, not fully, but enough. And when language starts to feel natural, something interesting happens. You stop focusing on how to say things, and you start focusing on what you want to say. That shift is everything. Because now, conversations become deeper, more personal, more real. That night, we talked about things we hadn't talked about before. Dreams, fears, future. What do you want in 5 years? I asked, slowly but clearly. They leaned back thinking, honestly, stability. A life that feels meaningful. Meaningful. That word stayed in the air for a moment. And you, they asked. I paused. Not because I didn't understand, but because I wanted to answer truthfully. I want to feel at home, I said. Not I want a house. Not I want a job. I want to feel at home. They nodded slowly. Yeah, that's bigger than it sounds. And that's when I realized something powerful. My English wasn't perfect, but it was enough to express something real. And when you can express something real, language becomes more than a skill. It becomes a bridge. There's a concept in communication theory called shared meaning. It means that true communication happens not when sentences are perfect, but when both people understand the same idea. And that night we shared meaning, not through complex vocabulary, but through simple, honest words. I think before English is wall, I said. They looked at me. And now it's like door. They smiled. That's a good way to describe it. A wall.
A door.
Same language. Different perspective. That's the transformation. At one point, they said something that made everything feel different. I feel like I know you now. Not just your English, but you. That sentence hit deeper than any compliment about improvement. Because for a long time, I felt like my language limitations were hiding who I really was. Like people could only see a smaller version of me. But now that version was expanding. Slowly, but clearly. I feel same, I said. Before, I don't know how to show myself. And now, they asked. I try, and you understand. They nodded. That's what matters. That's what matters. Not perfect grammar. Not native level fluency. Understanding. Connection. Presence. And that's when something else became clear. The conversations weren't just practice anymore. They were something I cared about. Something I didn't want to lose. And maybe something more. But I didn't rush that thought. Because some things don't need to be defined immediately. They grow better when you let them. We sat there for a while, not talking. But this silence felt different again. Not empty. Not heavy. Just comfortable. That kind of silence only happens when two people don't feel the need to fill every moment with words. And for someone who once feared silence in English, that felt like progress. Real progress. Before we left, we walked outside together. The air was cool. The city lights reflected on the street. I'm glad you didn't quit, they said suddenly. I looked at them. Me too. Because I knew exactly what they meant. There were many moments when I almost gave up. Moments when English felt too hard. Moments when life got in the way. Moments when I disappeared. But somehow, I came back. And that made all the difference. Because learning a language isn't about being perfect every day. It's about not quitting completely. I think English bring me here, I said. They tilted their heads slightly. Here with you. Silence. But this time, it wasn't just comfortable. It was meaningful. Because sometimes, the simplest sentences carry the most weight. And even though my English was still imperfect, that sentence said exactly what I meant. No more. No less. They smiled softly. I think so too. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. English didn't just help me survive in a new country. It didn't just help me order coffee or understand conversations. It helped me connect to someone, to a place, to a version of myself I didn't know before. And maybe that's the real goal, not to sound like a native, not to speak without mistakes, but to use language as a bridge to something meaningful. Because once you cross that bridge, you're not the same person anymore. From conversations to commitment. What if the moment you finally feel understood is also the moment your life becomes more complicated? Because connection is easy to enjoy, but commitment? That's where everything gets real. By this point, our conversations didn't feel like practice anymore. They felt like part of my life. Something steady. Something I quietly depended on. We still met at the park. Still walked. Still sat in cafes with soft music and slow conversations. But now, there was a rhythm between us that didn't need effort. And that's when life asked a bigger question. What is this really? One evening, we were walking after dinner. The city felt calm, lights reflecting on the sidewalk after a light rain. Everything looked softer. I have something to tell you, they said. That sentence immediately changed the air. Not heavy, but serious. I felt it. Okay, I replied. They took a small breath. I might move to another city. For work. There it was. Simple words. Clear meaning. And suddenly, everything inside me felt less clear. Oh, I said. Just one word. But it carried confusion, surprise, and something I didn't want to name yet. When? I asked. Maybe in a few months. Nothing final yet. A few months. Not tomorrow. Not immediate. But close enough to matter. We kept walking, but the rhythm was gone. Not broken. Just different. Because now, every moment felt limited. There's something psychological called scarcity effect. When you realize something might disappear, your brain values it more. Every conversation becomes more important. Every silence becomes more noticeable. Every word more meaningful. I didn't think about this, I admitted. Yet me neither, they said. We stopped walking, stood under a streetlight, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't know what to say. Not because I didn't have the vocabulary, but because I didn't have the clarity. This wasn't about English anymore. This was about emotion. And emotion is harder to organize than language. I feel strange, I said slowly. They smiled gently. Strange how? I searched for the right words. Not perfect words. Just honest ones. Before, we just talk. Learn. Easy. Now, I think more. About what? About losing this. There it was. Simple. Direct. Real. They didn't respond immediately. And that silence felt full. Because sometimes, the most important answers don't come quickly. I've been thinking too, they said finally. And just like that, everything felt closer. Because now it wasn't just my thoughts. It was shared. There's something important about this moment in any relationship when both people stop pretending it's simple. When they admit that something matters. That's when things change. Not always in a comfortable way, but in a real way. I didn't expect this, I said. Neither did I, they replied. It started with a book and a very strange sentence. We both laughed. You drop your life, I said. Exactly, they smiled. But behind that joke was something deeper. Because that mistake had turned into something neither of us planned. And now we had to decide what to do with it. I don't want this to just end, I said. There was no perfect grammar in that sentence. But there was clarity. And that's what mattered. They looked at me carefully. It doesn't have to end. Even if you move. Even then. That answer felt hopeful, but also uncertain. Because long distance, different cities, different routines, it's not easy. Especially when everything started so simply. There's a concept in psychology called uncertainty tolerance. Some people need clear answers, clear plans, clear outcomes. Others can live in the unknown, at least for a while. That night, I realized I was somewhere in between. I didn't need a perfect plan, but I needed something real to hold on to. What are we doing? I asked quietly. It was the simplest version of a complicated question. They didn't rush to answer. And I respected that. Because rushing this moment would make it less honest. I think we're building something, they said. Building. Not defining. Not labeling. Just building. And somehow that felt right. Because everything between us had grown naturally. Conversation by conversation. Moment by moment. Mistake by mistake. Why force it into a definition too early? I can try to continue, I said. Even if not easy. They smiled. I'd like that. That sentence felt like a small agreement. Not perfect. Not guaranteed. But real. And sometimes that's enough. We stood there for a while longer. Not saying much.
But not needing to.
Because at this point, silence wasn't empty anymore. It was part of the connection. Before we left, they said something that stayed with me. You know, your English isn't the only thing that changed. I looked at them. What else? You. That word felt heavier than expected. Because deep down, I knew it was true. I was different. More open. More willing to speak. More willing to feel. And maybe that's the real transformation. Not just learning a language, but becoming someone who isn't afraid to use it. To connect. To risk.
To care.
As I walked home that night, my mind was full. Not with vocabulary. Not with grammar. But with questions. With possibilities. With something that felt both exciting and uncertain. Because sometimes the next step in your journey isn't about learning more. It's about choosing what matters. And being willing to continue, even when the path isn't clear. Because that's where real stories begin. Not in certainty, but in the decision to move forward anyway. Building a life. One conversation at a time. What if the thing you thought was temporary slowly becomes your permanent life? Not in one big moment. Not with a dramatic decision, but through small choices repeated again and again. That's how it happened. After that night, the one with a quiet streetlight, the uncertain future, and the simple agreement to keep going, something shifted again. Not in a way you could easily see, but in a way you could feel. We didn't suddenly become something official. We didn't define everything with perfect words. Instead, we continued. And sometimes, continuing is the most powerful decision you can make. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. And that maybe move to another city conversation? It became real. They got the job. Another city. A few hours away. Not too far. But far enough to change everything. I'm leaving next month, they said one afternoon, sitting in our usual cafe. This time, there was no surprise. Just a quiet understanding. I know, I replied. Because we had been preparing for this moment, without saying it directly. There's something about gradual change. It gives you time to adjust emotionally, even if you don't realize it. So, what do we do now? I asked. That question again. But this time, it felt less uncertain. Because we had already started building something. Now, we just needed to decide how to continue it. We keep talking, they said simply. Like before? Like now, but differently. Differently. That word held a lot inside it. More distance. More effort. More intention. Because when something is no longer easy, you have to choose it. Again and again. And that's what we did. After they moved, our conversations changed form. From face-to-face to voice calls. From shared silence to scheduled time. From spontaneous meetings to planned moments. At first, it felt strange, hearing their voice through a phone instead of sitting across from them. No eye contact. No shared environment. Just sound. But something interesting happened. My listening improved even more. Because now I had to rely only on audio.
No facial expressions. No gestures.
Just words, tone, rhythm. And remember what we practiced? Slow listening. Main ideas. Context. All of it became useful.
Real.
I think, I understand you better now on phone, I said once. They laughed. That's a good sign.
It was.
Because it meant my brain had adapted again. Not just to English, but to a new way of connecting. We talked almost every day. Sometimes short. Sometimes long. Sometimes about nothing important. But that consistency built something strong. There's a concept called emotional repetition. When you share small moments regularly, your brain builds a sense of connection over time. Not through big events, but through presence. And that's exactly what was happening. One night during a call, they asked, "Do you ever think about the future?" I smiled. Now, yes. Before, I didn't. Because everything felt temporary, unstable, uncertain.
But now something had changed.
What do you think about? They asked. I took a breath. I think maybe I stay here. Build life. Not just survive. They were quiet for a second, then said softly, I like that. That sentence felt simple, but it meant something deeper. Because now, our conversations weren't just about the present. They were about the future. And that's when things become real. We started visiting each other on weekends. Long drives. Short stays. Simple routines.
Cooking together.
Walking. Talking. Always talking. And something surprising happened. My English felt natural. Not perfect. Still mistakes. Still pauses. But no fear. Because I wasn't thinking about language anymore. I was thinking about life. And when language becomes part of life, it stops feeling like a subject. It becomes a tool, a bridge, a habit. One weekend, while cooking together, I said something without thinking. Before, I am afraid speak English. Now, I afraid not speak with you. They stopped for a second, looked at me, and smiled. That's a big difference.
It was.
Because fear had changed direction. Before, I feared making mistakes. Now, I feared losing connection. And that's a different kind of motivation. A stronger one. One that pushes you forward instead of holding you back. Months passed, and slowly, life started to take shape. Not perfectly.
Not clearly.
But steadily. We talked about bigger things. Living in the same city. Work. Stability. Family. Not in one serious conversation, but in many small ones. Spread over time. Because real decisions don't always happen in one moment. They grow. Just like everything else in the story. One evening, sitting together again after a long week, they said, "You know, this doesn't feel temporary anymore." I nodded. Me too. And that was it.
No dramatic declaration.
No perfect sentence. Just mutual understanding. And sometimes that's more powerful than words. Because at the beginning, I came to the U.S. feeling lost. Alone. Disconnected. English was a barrier.
A wall.
Something that made me feel small.
But now?
It was part of something bigger. A life. A connection. A future. Not because I mastered it, but because I used it. Every day. In real moments. With real meaning. And maybe that's the lesson. You don't need perfect English to build a life. You need courage to use imperfect English consistently. Because over time, those imperfect conversations turn into something real, something stable, something you never planned, but wouldn't want to lose. And somehow, without realizing it, I wasn't just learning English anymore. I was building a life one conversation at a time. The happy ending you didn't expect. What if your bad English story doesn't end with perfect grammar, but with a life you're proud to live? Because if you've been waiting for the moment when everything becomes flawless, this might surprise you. That moment never came. And yet, everything still worked out. Years passed. Not in a dramatic, movie-like way, but in quiet, steady chapters. The kind you don't notice while you're living them, but later realize changed everything. We eventually moved to the same city. Not because it was easy, but because it felt right. There were long discussions, practical concerns, work adjustments, financial stress, real life. Because love doesn't remove challenges. It just gives you a reason to face them together. I think we can try, I said one night, sitting at a small kitchen table.
Not a perfect sentence.
Still not, but clear. And clarity matters more than perfection. We've been trying, they replied, smiling. And that was true. This whole story was already an attempt. A continuous one. We found a small apartment. Nothing special, but it was ours. The first night there, sitting on the floor with no furniture, eating simple takeout, I looked around and thought, this is home. Not because of the place, but because of the feeling. And that feeling came from everything we built. Conversation by conversation. Mistake by mistake. There's something important I want you to notice here. I didn't suddenly become fluent. I didn't wake up one day speaking perfect English like a native. I still made mistakes. Sometimes I still do. I forget lock the door, I said one evening. They laughed gently. You forgot to lock the door. Same correction style. Same patience. But now it felt different. Because mistakes were no longer something to fear. They were part of our daily life. Normal. Natural. Human. We got married in a small ceremony. Nothing big. Just a few close friends. Simple words. Simple vows. And when it was my turn to speak, I didn't try to be perfect. I didn't memorize a complicated speech. I just spoke. Slowly. Honestly. Before I afraid speak English, I said,
now.
English bring me to you. There were pauses. There were small mistakes, but there were also tears and smiles because everyone understood. That's the point. Not perfect language, but shared meaning. Later, we had children. And that's when things became even more interesting. Because now language wasn't just something I was learning.
It was something I was passing on.
Daddy, say it again, they would ask. And I would repeat simple sentences.
Clear. Slow.
Just like I learned. And sometimes they would correct me. Innocently. Naturally. And instead of feeling embarrassed, I laughed. Because the fear was gone. Completely. There's something powerful about that transformation. From someone who was afraid to say one sentence, to someone raising a family in that language. Not perfectly, but confidently. Because confidence doesn't come from being flawless. It comes from experience. From repetition. From surviving hundreds of small, imperfect moments and realizing you're still okay. Looking back, I see everything differently now. That first coffee shop. That question I didn't understand. For here or to go? That embarrassing moment. That small panic. That simple yes to something I didn't even know. At the time, it felt like failure.
But now?
It feels like the beginning. Because right after that, came the park.
The book.
The sentence. You drop your life. Still wrong. Still funny. But also the most important sentence I ever said. Because it started everything. There's a concept in psychology called reframing. It means looking at the same event, but giving it a different meaning. What you think is a mistake might actually be a turning point. What you think is embarrassment might actually be connection. What you think is failure might actually be progress in disguise. And if you're watching this right now, feeling stuck, feeling slow, feeling like your English isn't good enough, I want you to remember something. You don't need perfect English to change your life. You don't need to understand every word. You don't need to speak without mistakes. You just need to keep going.
Keep speaking.
Keep listening. Keep showing up, even when it feels uncomfortable. Because one day, you might look back at your worst sentence and realize it led you to your best life. Now, when I sit in a cafe, hearing fast conversations around me, I don't feel lost anymore. I don't feel like an outsider. I feel part of it. Not because I became someone else, but because I stayed long enough to grow into it. And sometimes, I still hear that question in my head. What if the biggest mistake in your English leads you to the love of your life? For me, it did. And maybe for you, it's just about to begin. What if your next mistake in English isn't something to fix, but something to follow? Because somewhere out there in a small, ordinary moment, a coffee order, a short reply, a sentence you almost don't say, your story might already be waiting. Not a perfect story, not a fluent one,
But a real one.
the kind that changes how you see yourself and how the world sees you. If this story felt familiar, it's not a coincidence. It's a signal that you're closer than you think. So don't wait to be perfect. Don't wait to feel ready. Speak now. Listen slowly. Stay in the conversation. And if you want more stories like this, real, emotional, simple English that helps you train your ears like a native, build confidence from B1 to C2, and turn your mistakes into meaningful moments, then hit subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and come back for the next journey. Because your English story isn't finished. It's just getting interesting.